Good morning. Today we start chapter 11, 12, and 13 we're going to look at. And this starts a new kind of section in the book of Leviticus. The first 7 chapters dealt with how the Israelites could lead holy lives, lives acceptable to God. Chapters 8 through 10 we looked at Saturday. Were about the priests, the ordination of the priests, Aaron and his sons. And 11 through 15 deal with clean and unclean animals, people, rituals and stuff for that. And chapter 11 deals mainly with the clean and unclean foods. And it's one of those things that, in some ways it really seems strange to me. But it was what God was telling them. The Lord speaks to Moses and Aaron, saying, speak to the people. So Moses and Aaron are both hearing this, Moses as the leader, Aaron as the chief priest or whatever you want to call him. From the land animals, he says, there are creatures you may eat. Any animal that has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed. So he's got divided hoofs that are spread apart. Cows, deer, giraffes. There are quite a number that way of animals that way. So a divided hoof and chews the cud. So like a pig has a divided hoof but doesn't chew its cud. So a pig is unclean. They can't eat that. The unclean animal, while it's living, they could herd pigs. Why would they want to? I don't know. And that's, in the parable of the prodigal son, the son that goes away finds himself herding pigs, which is, a job that no good Israelite person would want. But anyway, so a divided hoof that is cleft-footed and chews the cud. But it says, but among those that chew the cud and have divided hoofs, you shall not eat the camel, because it doesn't have a divided hoof. It's unclean. The rock badger, doesn't, and the hare and the pig, even though it has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed, meets 2 of the criteria, doesn't chew the cud, can't eat that animal. It says of their flesh you shall not eat, and of their carcasses. So if a pig dies, you can't touch it, or then you are unclean. If a pig is living, you could touch it, you could hurt it, you could do those things. But, when an unclean animal dies, it somehow emits something that if you touch it, then you become unclean, strange. And then, these you may eat of all that in the waters that have fins and scales, whether in the seas or streams. But anything that does not have fins or scales, you can't eat. So a crab doesn't have fins or scales. A starfish, so there was that distinction, having skins or skins and scales. So like an eel, nope, can't eat that because it doesn't. And then, birds come with a whole list of birds that they shouldn't eat. The eagle, the vulture, the osprey, the buzzard, the kite, the ravens, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, the little owl, the garment, so there's quite a list of birds that are unclean for them to eat. And so therefore, they had to be aware of that. And then winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you. But among them, you can eat those that have a jointed leg above the foot. So again, a very fine distinction. They walk on all 4 legs, but they have a jointed leg. And so then you can eat the locust, the bald locust, the grasshopper, and that way. And so when we hear, right here, locusts were legitimate food to eat. So when John the Baptist comes, wearing the hair of a camel and eating locusts and wild honey, it was a perfectly acceptable food for them to eat. So, not so out of the ordinary, even though it sounds out of the ordinary to us. And then it goes on, talks about, if you touch the carcass of things, you're unclean, and things that are, verse 29, these are unclean creatures that swarm among the earth for you. the weasel, the mouse, the lizards, geckos, and, quite a list of things that swarm upon the earth. I mean, and, different things that way. And how it, can be clean and unclean. And then verse 39, if an animal which you eat dies, anyone who touches its carcass will be unclean till evening. So, I mean, if they slaughter an animal for eating, sounds like that's okay. But if it dies, then if you touch it, it's unclean. Or maybe if you are the one that's slaughtering it, I mean, maybe fine details that we would have had to live then to know for sure. But as we get to the end of this chapter, verse 44 44 and 45 are important verses. He says, for I am the Lord your God, sanctify yourselves therefore. Set yourselves apart and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves that way. And then verse 45 again, for I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, reminding them of who this God is. And then he says again, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And that's something that, we don't think too much about, really. I mean, you are holy. I am holy. I mean, and it doesn't mean I got holes in my body. It means that I am sanctified. I'm set apart from the sins and the evils of the world. And I am holy. Why? Because God is holy. Because God is gracious and merciful and gives me that forgiveness and acceptance that I don't deserve. But I am holy. You are holy because God is holy. Chapter 12 deals with the purification of women after childbirth. And again, to me, this is just really, but there's a distinction. If the woman has a male child, she's unclean for 7 days, and then they circumcise the child, and then she has 33 days of purification, so 40 days. If she has a female child, she's unclean for 14 days, twice as long as with the male child, and then it's 66 days of purification, total of 80 days. I mean, what's the difference? I mean, but this is what God told the people. So this is what the people went by. And, and then, in verse 6, when the days of her purification are completed, whether for a son or a daughter, she will bring to the priest something for a burnt offering, a lamb if she can afford it, or 2 turtle doves or pigeons, that way. And so it's another one of those rituals that, in so many ways in our society today, don't make sense. We don't practice those things, but it's this is what God says. And why there's a distinction between male and female, that have been born, a boy or a girl, is just odd. Just plain odd as far as I'm concerned. Chapter 13 deals with leprosy, the diseases of the skin. And when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling and an eruption, whatever, he comes to the priest. And so these priests, I mean, when we think of a priest, what do we think about? We think about a person who is leading worship, maybe, and teaching confirmation, doing, that kind of stuff. We don't think of a priest as one who, is the doctor, is looking at somebody and saying, hey, this is a leprous disease. But, but within this leprosy, there were many different things. The person would come and the priest would examine him. And then, if the hair wasn't white, but the skin was white, well, then you could wait another 7 days and then come back again, give it a week and then come back. And if the hair still isn't white, well, then it's, and then it goes on in there, it says, if your whole body turns white, then you're clean again. How can that, it doesn't make sense to me. If you got some stuff on your hands and on your arms, and you're unclean, well, then if this white covers your whole body, all of a sudden you're clean? But that's what it says in here, And, in verse 13, if the disease has covered all of the body, he shall pronounce him clean of the disease. It's just weird stuff. But But, if there is flesh showing, if the disease has caused an open sore, well, then it's leprous. And the serious part of it we get to when we get over to verse 45 of chapter 13. The person who has the leprous disease shall wear torn clothing. Let the hair of his head be disheveled, and he shall cover his upper lip. Grow a mustache is what I take that to mean. And he shall cry out, unclean, unclean, to anyone that would come by. And as we read of Jesus, the 10 lepers, they warned him, they were lepers. They would, unclean. This was something they had to say, and they lived apart from the community. These 10 and others as well that we read about different places in the Bible. They weren't allowed to live with their families and those things. And then the landing here, excuse me, when we get to verse 52, it starts talking about the clothing. And it talks about the warp and the woof of the clothing and how the clothing is unclean. But warp and woof. Warp, like in your jeans, the warp would be the material, the cloth that goes from your waist all the way down your leg, the lengthwise. And the woof goes crosswise. Warp and woof. Weird things to call them, I guess, but they had names for them. But anyway, so they talk about, how if your clothes become unclean because they've, been touching your leprous body, you burn them. You do different things. When I came upon those words, warp and woof, I thought, what on earth is this? And I guess I learned something today. And I hope every day we learn more about God's love and God's grace, but we remember the enormous love that God has for us.